The transfer happened without a public ceremony, without a palace announcement, and most dangerously, without Camilla being told. Inside a private sitting room at Royal Lodge, Prince Edward placed an old brass key into Lady Louise's hand and told her that responsibility had finally passed to the next generation. It looked like a simple family gesture. But within the monarchy, keys are never merely keys. They represent access, memory, authority, and control. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Edward had called the meeting quietly. Only Louise, Sophie, and one long-serving household official were present. No representative from Charles's household had been invited, and nobody from Camilla's office knew the discussion was taking place. Royal Lodge carried decades of private family history, and its restricted rooms contained records, personal objects, and memories that could become powerful in the wrong hands. The decision was stated without ceremony. Edward formally transferred the principal private keys to Louise, granting her custodial access to the residents' protected rooms, storage areas, and historic household records. Custodial access meant she could safeguard those spaces and control who entered them without personally owning everything inside. Louise did not reach for the key immediately. She understood that accepting it would pull her into a dispute involving senior members of the family. Her public role had always been restrained, almost deliberately distant from palace conflict. Now her father was asking her to stand at the center of something dangerous. Edward removed the brass key from his ring and placed it between them. Nobody spoke. Sophie watched her daughter's confusion harden into solemn resolve, feeling pride rise beside fear. The trusted confidant knew Louise was capable, but she also knew capability offered no protection from royal resentment. "This is about protecting what comes next," Edward told her quietly. Louise closed her fingers around the key. The household official received an immediate instruction. The internal access register, a formal record showing who may enter protected areas, was to be updated that day. From that moment, access to the private office would require Louise's personal approval. Edward had not merely passed her a symbol, he had transferred practical authority. Camilla knew nothing. At that same hour, her staff were preparing a request to examine several objects stored at Royal Lodge, assuming the Queen Consort's access remained unchanged. That assumption survived less than 24 hours. The first warning came when one of her aides arrived, presented the usual authorization, and discovered that an internal lock had been changed. What Edward intended as a quiet act of protection was about to be interpreted as an open declaration of defiance, and the first person forced to confront it would not be Camilla, but the aide standing helplessly outside a locked door. Lady Louise had spent most of her life avoiding the machinery of royal ambition. She did not compete for headlines, demand a larger title, or position herself near the center of power. That was precisely why Edward trusted her. Yet the moment the keys entered her possession, her quietness became politically significant. Louise had not pursued authority, but authority had found her, wrapped in family duty and sharpened by the knowledge that someone powerful would soon demand it back. Louise had always seemed removed from the rivalries that shaped senior royal life. She carried out duties without building a public campaign around them, and Edward believed that restraint made her the safest possible custodian. Royal Lodge needed protection, not another claimant. Its importance reached beyond valuable furniture or historic objects. The residence also held private correspondence, family photographs, and rooms connected to earlier generations, making control over access emotionally and politically sensitive. Sophie understood the danger immediately. Her daughter admitted that accepting the keys made her fear appearing disloyal to Charles and Camilla. The trusted confidant did not dismiss that fear. She told Louise that obedience and loyalty were not always the same. Obedience meant following an instruction. Loyalty meant protecting the family's long-term interests, even when doing so created discomfort in the present. Edward carried his own private guilt. He knew the decision placed pressure on Louise, and he understood that she had never asked to stand between competing households. Yet the prince also believed that leaving authority unresolved would invite repeated claims, sudden inspections, and private removals that nobody could easily challenge later. Edward explained that Louise was not inheriting Royal Lodge or receiving personal ownership. She had been given temporary custodial authority under a private family arrangement, meaning she could protect restricted areas and approve access while the larger future of the residence remained unsettled. The distinction mattered. She was guarding the property, not claiming it. Sophie then disclosed that Edward had considered 2 other relatives before choosing Louise. He rejected both because their involvement would have turned the transfer into an immediate struggle for influence. One choice would have alarmed the king's household. The other would have drawn public attention before the locks were even changed. Louise remained alone with her mother after the meeting. She placed the brass key across her palm and asked whether accepting it had made her someone's enemy. Sophie closed her daughter's hand around it. Only if they intended to take what was never theirs. The answer came sooner than either expected. Camilla's aide telephoned Edward's household and demanded an explanation for the changed lock, speaking as though access had been a right rather than a privilege. Louise had accepted the key as an act of family service, but the telephone call made one truth unavoidable. Someone inside the Queen's circle already believed Royal Lodge belonged within Camilla's reach. The transfer did not begin with a key. It began months earlier with a winter meeting that ended in silence. On that night, a request from Camilla's household reached Edward, asking for access to the private office at Royal Lodge before a proposed inventory review. The wording was courteous, but its meaning was unmistakable. Someone expected the door to be opened without question. Edward refused, and from that moment, the residence became a test of who truly controlled the family's private inheritance. Edward had already spent months overseeing sensitive possessions stored inside the residence. Some were linked to the late Queen, others to Prince Philip, and many carried memories from earlier generations. The dispute mattered because the rooms were not ordinary household spaces. They formed part of a private family stewardship, an arrangement in which selected relatives protected objects without treating them as personal property. The tension reached breaking point during a January meeting at Windsor. Camilla asked Edward to authorize her heritage advisor to enter the sealed office before the end of the week. A heritage advisor is an official who reviews historic objects, records, and preservation needs. Her request sounded procedural, but the deadline made it feel like a command. Edward refused in front of Charles. He said nobody should enter until the family had agreed on a custodian. The prince spoke calmly, yet the refusal struck with force. Camilla felt challenged before her husband, while the king sat trapped between loyalty to his wife and trust in his younger brother. Charles approached Edward after the meeting. He asked whether such a direct refusal had truly been necessary. The younger brother answered that informal access could become accepted practice after a single exception. Once that happened, the family might never regain control of the rooms or the records inside them. Edward's concern deepened when he later received a copied administrative draft. The access request had been prepared before Camilla ever raised the subject with him. Her household had already listed dates, staff names, and intended areas of review, suggesting approval had been treated as automatic. That discovery changed everything. Edward no longer trusted verbal assurances. He began preparing a private transfer of custodial responsibility to someone outside the immediate dispute, someone whose restraint could not easily be mistaken for ambition. Louise became the answer because she stood beyond the rivalry that had poisoned the conversation. Edward returned the unsigned authorization to Camilla as the January meeting ended. She left it untouched. The Queen watched him depart, while Charles remained seated between them, unable to repair what had just broken. The January refusal had wounded pride, but the transfer to Louise threatened something deeper. It suggested that Edward no longer trusted private assurances from the very top of the family. Camilla did not learn about the transfer from Edward, Charles, or an official palace briefing. She learned because her aide was turned away. By the time the explanation reached her, the private embarrassment had already become personal. The Queen requested an immediate meeting with Edward and arrived expecting clarification. Instead, she found Louise sitting beside her father, the Royal Lodge key resting openly on the table between them, like a challenge no one was willing to name. Camilla had summoned Edward to Clarence's house, but he refused to attend without Louise. The prince insisted that the authority being questioned now belonged to his daughter, and any discussion about access had to include her. Sophie accompanied them, and remained slightly apart. The trusted confidant did not intend to control the exchange, yet her presence made one thing unmistakable. Louise would not face senior royal pressure alone. Camilla spoke first. She told Edward that excluding her office created the appearance of mistrust and weakened the unity of the family. The Queen expected him to soften. He did not. Stewardship, he replied, was not a judgment about status. It was the duty of protecting property, records, and family memory for those who came next. He would not apologize for placing Royal Lodge under clear control. Camilla then turned directly toward Louise. Her question was simple, but the weight behind it was crushing. Did she truly intend to deny the Queen access to a royal residence? Louise felt the full force of rank pressing against her. Still, she answered calmly. She would authorize entry only after the purpose, personnel, and specific items involved were listed in writing. The response was not rebellious. That made it more powerful. Camilla had expected hesitation, perhaps even surrender. Instead, she received a boundary. Edward added that the internal access register had already been amended. The register was the official record identifying who could enter protected rooms and under what conditions. A telephone call could not reverse it. Neither could an informal instruction passed through palace staff. Camilla reached toward the brass key, then stopped before touching it. Louise drew it closer to herself. The movement was small, almost polite, yet it changed the balance of the room. The object no longer belonged to the argument. It belonged to the person guarding it. Sophie noticed her daughter's hand trembling beneath the table. Without speaking, she placed her own hand over Louise's wrist until the shaking stopped. Camilla saw the gesture and understood that fear had not disappeared. It had simply failed to control her. The Queen left without securing access. She went directly to Charles. The confrontation ended without raised voices, yet every person in the room understood that the real battle had only shifted location from a daughter holding a key to a king being asked to take it from her. Charles possessed the crown, but that did not mean every family decision could be erased by royal command. When Camilla asked him to reverse the transfer, he discovered that Edward had built the arrangement around a distinction the monarchy rarely discussed in public: the difference between sovereign authority and private family stewardship. The king could demand obedience, but demanding that Louise surrender the key would expose a conflict Charles desperately wanted to keep hidden. Charles summoned his legal secretary and a senior household advisor for a private consultation. The legal secretary was the official responsible for turning the monarch's decisions into formal written instructions, while the household advisor managed practical matters inside the royal residences. Both men confirmed that the brass key carried no constitutional power. The written access order attached to it, however, gave Louise legitimate control over routine entry unless the family formally intervened. Charles felt the betrayal immediately. Edward had acted without asking him, and that omission cut deeply between two brothers already carrying years of unspoken tension. Yet the king also understood why consultation had been avoided. Edward believed any early discussion would invite pressure from Camilla's office before a neutral arrangement could be secured. Charles resented that judgment because part of him feared it was true. Camilla refused to accept delay. She told her husband that silence would make her appear powerless inside her own family. The Queen Consort argued that staff would soon treat Louise's approval as superior to hers. Charles answered that forcing his niece to surrender the key could make them appear vindictive, especially when the young woman had never sought influence or publicly challenged the crown. The legal secretary then delivered the warning Charles had hoped to avoid. Canceling the arrangement would require a written directive carrying the king's approval. That order would create a permanent record showing that the monarch had personally intervened against Louise. Future advisors, historians, and perhaps even the wider family could one day examine it. Charles discovered another failure when the household advisor produced a private note from Sophie. She had written days before the transfer, requesting a family discussion before any decision became final. An aide had categorized the message as a routine household matter, and it never reached the king's desk. Charles read Sophie's words twice. He removed his glasses and placed the proposed reversal order beside them without signing it. Camilla watched every movement, but the monarch gave her no immediate answer. He was trapped between loyalty to his wife and protective concern for a niece who had never used royal proximity for personal advantage. The unsigned order solved nothing. By leaving the order unsigned, Charles avoided humiliating Louise, but he also allowed the first practical consequences of Edward's decision to spread through the royal households. The fallout began quietly. Revised staff lists, cancelled appointments, unanswered requests. Yet behind each administrative change was a human reaction. Camilla saw her authority narrowing. Edward saw proof that the transfer had been necessary. Louise saw strangers suddenly studying her every decision. And Charles, trapped between them, realized that a single key had exposed divisions the palace had spent months pretending did not exist. Royal Lodge staff received new instructions before the week ended. Every request concerning the private office, family archive room, or secured cabinets had to pass through Louise or Edward's household. The archive room held private family records rather than public state documents, making access a matter of personal trust as much as administration. A heritage inspection involving Camilla's advisor was postponed because the required names and purpose had not been submitted under the new procedure. Camilla received the cancellation while preparing for a public engagement. She read the message twice, dismissed her dresser, and remained alone for several minutes. The Queen Consort had expected resistance from Edward, but she had not expected junior staff to enforce it so openly. What wounded her most was not the delay. It was the feeling that she was being treated like an outsider, asking permission to enter her own family's history. Louise suffered differently. Staff members became careful around her, lowering their voices and measuring every answer. She told Sophie that she had wanted to preserve the residence, not become its gatekeeper in a family war. Her mother reminded her that boundaries often looked harshest when people had grown comfortable ignoring them. Still, the trusted confidant could see how quickly duty was costing her daughter peace. Edward's suspicions deepened when he discovered 2 further access requests scheduled for later that month. Neither had been discussed with him. One concerned a secured cabinet containing private photographs and personal correspondence, not objects prepared for official display. The prince no longer believed the proposed review was limited to preservation. Louise received a folder containing all postponed applications. She studied the names, dates, and stated purposes before writing "pending family agreement" across the first page. Then, she closed it firmly. The decision frightened her, but uncertainty would have been more dangerous. Charles telephoned Louise himself. The king did not demand the key or challenge her authority. He asked whether she felt pressured. She answered honestly that she did, but not by Edward. Her words stripped away every excuse built by competing households. For the first time, Charles heard the crisis through Louise's voice rather than through competing households, and what she told him made a private reckoning unavoidable. There were no secretaries, no legal advisors, and no written statements when Charles met Louise alone. The king entered expecting to explain the pressures surrounding Royal Lodge. Instead, his niece asked one question that stripped the dispute of rank and protocol. Did he believe she had accepted the key for personal power? Charles looked at her, saw the hurt beneath her composure, and realized that the monarchy's conflict had landed on the shoulders of the family member least prepared to exploit it. Charles had asked for a private meeting at Windsor, and made one condition clear. This was a conversation between uncle and niece, not sovereign and subject. Louise arrived carrying the brass key, but no files, access forms, or legal notes. The absence mattered. She was not there to defend procedure. She was there to discover whether trust still existed beneath the argument. Louise spoke without anger. She told Charles she would return the key immediately if he believed Edward had acted dishonorably or placed family property at risk. Yet she would not surrender it merely to spare Camilla embarrassment. The distinction was painful but necessary. One reason concerned integrity. The other concerned appearances. Charles absorbed the words slowly. He admitted that he had allowed tensions between the households to grow because confronting them would have forced choices he did not want to make. The king had hoped delay might calm the dispute. Instead, silence had allowed suspicion to harden around Louise. Her disappointment affected him more deeply than accusation would have. Charles then revealed his decision. He would not reverse the transfer. Instead, he proposed a family stewardship agreement, a written set of equal rules governing who could enter protected rooms, request records, and approve inspections. Louise would remain custodian, but her authority would be clearly limited by responsibility rather than personal preference. Louise agreed on one condition. Camilla would not be permanently excluded, and neither would any other relative with a legitimate purpose. But rank alone would never create automatic access. Every request had to identify the people involved, the reason for entry, and the items being examined. Louise placed the key between them and asked Charles to decide. The king remained silent before pushing it back toward her. Responsibility, he said, should remain where trust had been placed. Charles felt relief, but regret remained beneath it. Louise left no longer feeling like a pawn in Edward's dispute or Camilla's humiliation. She left as a custodian whose authority had been personally recognized by the monarch. Inside Windsor, the family had found a fragile agreement, but outside its walls, one photograph and one headline were about to turn a private act of stewardship into a national royal drama. The story broke before the palace could frame it. By sunrise, the Royal Lodge key had become more than a household object. It was presented as a symbol of generational change, Edward's distrust, Louise's unexpected rise, and Camilla's exclusion. The private agreement Charles had carefully shaped was reduced to a single explosive question across television studios and front pages. Why had the Queen been kept in the dark while a young royal was handed control? The palace responded with a restrained statement, confirming that Louise had accepted a limited family stewardship role connected to the private areas of Royal Lodge. Stewardship meant responsibility for protecting access and preserving sensitive family spaces, not ownership of the residence itself. The wording emphasized accountability, conservation, and one equal process for every household. Yet the calmer the language became, the more dramatic the public interpretation grew. Camilla read the coverage as humiliation. She told Charles that none of it would have happened if Edward had spoken to her before transferring the key. The Queen believed the secrecy had allowed commentators to portray her as defeated and distrusted. The king did not deny the damage, but he reminded her that the January request had already made his brother fear that discussion would become pressure. Louise struggled with a different kind of pain. A quiet duty she had accepted for her family was suddenly treated as a rise to power. The young royal told Sophie that strangers were assigning ambition to an act she had never wanted publicized. Her mother answered that headlines could distort motives, but could not change the integrity of the decision. Louise still felt exposed, yet the trusted confidant refused to let shame replace resolve. Edward rejected palace advice to describe the arrangement as temporary. The prince argued that such wording would make Louise appear disposable and invite fresh attempts to bypass her before the family agreement was complete. Her role, he insisted, would continue until the new rules were fully established. Charles approved the strongest sentence in the statement himself. Every member of the royal family, regardless of title or rank, would follow the same access procedure. The monarch knew that line would anger some inside the households, but removing it would destroy the principle he had just defended to Louise. A newspaper soon carried the headline, "The Daughter with the Key," above an image of Louise leaving Windsor beside Edward. That evening, a broadcaster called the transfer a quiet redistribution of trust inside the House of Windsor. Near the castle gates, a supporter held a handwritten sign reading, "Duty before status." The message became the symbol the palace could no longer control. The country had turned the key into a verdict, but only the family could decide whether it represented exclusion, rebellion, or a new standard of responsibility. In the end, the crisis was settled not by defeating Camilla, elevating Louise, or diminishing Charles. It was settled by defining the purpose of the key. Royal Lodge would not become a prize in a struggle for influence. Its private rooms would be protected through written rules, shared accountability, and a custodian chosen because she had never sought power. Louise kept the key, but she kept it as a duty, not as a weapon. Charles formally approved the Royal Lodge Family Stewardship Agreement, a written arrangement establishing how the residents' protected rooms would be accessed and preserved. Louise would remain principal custodian, but custodianship did not mean ownership, inheritance, or higher royal rank. It meant responsibility. She would approve entry, protect private material, and consult the family before any sensitive object or record was examined. Camilla accepted the process only after receiving a personal assurance that she had not been permanently excluded. The Queen acknowledged that her household should have requested consultation rather than assuming access would be granted automatically. The admission did not erase her humiliation, but it showed that she finally understood why Edward had acted. Edward then faced Charles without defensiveness. The prince admitted that secrecy had intensified the conflict and placed an unfair burden on Louise. He did not regret protecting Royal Lodge, yet he accepted that his daughter should never again be positioned between senior relatives without warning. The king heard the apology for what it was, not surrender, but responsibility. Louise proved her intentions through action. She authorized a limited visit involving Camilla and Sophie together, ensuring that neither household entered alone. When the Queen reached the private office, she discovered that nothing had been removed, rearranged, or claimed. The room remained untouched. That single fact changed the meaning of the transfer. Edward had not tried to seize control for his family. He had tried to prevent any one household from controlling what belonged to them all. Camilla paused beside Louise before leaving. "You guarded the door because we failed to agree on who should open it," she said. Louise answered quietly that the door could remain open when trust was shared. Charles watched Camilla and Edward leave without hostility. For the first time since the crisis began, the monarch was not being forced to choose between them. Louise kept the key because she had shown that authority could exist without ambition, while Camilla's acceptance prevented wounded pride from becoming permanent division. Royal Lodge remained part of the family's inheritance, but the deeper legacy belonged to Louise. She had been handed a key in secrecy, tested beneath the weight of royal power, and emerged not as a rival to the crown, but as proof that the monarchy's future would depend on trust, earned quietly, and protected with courage. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.